Most of us are familiar with black tea and green tea, but how many of you have tried white tea? If you haven't, it's a lovely flavor and one that we're going to talk about on today's episode of Let's Talk Tea. Hello, tea lovers! Welcome to Rebecca's Tea Cozy, where we share a love of tea and other things that are cozy to nourish our bodies and our souls. Today, we're going to talk about white tea, which is one of the 6 types of tea that come from the Camellia sinensis plant. We've been talking in this series all about the types of teas and how each one is categorized. So white tea is a very special tea. It originated in the Fujian province of China, and it's still a lesser known of one of those 6 types of tea. It has a lovely flavor, a wonderful aroma, and it's just a beautiful tea to enjoy. So let's talk about the process of the tea, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the teas that we're going to try today. If you've been tuned into the most recent episodes, this will look very familiar to you. These are the stages that are in the tea production of the different types of teas. Not all teas undergo all of these stages, and not all teas go in this order of the stages. White tea is special because it actually is the least processed of all the teas. Now, that might sound a little confusing because last week when we were talking about green tea, we said that it's the least oxidized, which is true because green tea is heated shortly after plucking to halt the oxidation process, leaving it green. The difference with white tea is it actually only undergoes 2 stages after plucking. First, they allow withering time, and so it might wither up to several days. And then after withering, it goes straight to the drying stage. And this is what makes white tea unique because it has such a low level of processing. There's no rolling, there's no firing, although some teas that I was reading about white tea did say that instead of withering, there's a steaming process. And with more countries opening up their doors to producing white tea, there are different varieties of teas and different gradings of teas being produced. So it might impact the information that I'm sharing right now. But traditionally, white tea goes from plucking to withering for several days to then being laid out so that it can dry, whether that's in the sun or whether it's in racks with a very low fan to continue to keep the air circulating until that moisture content is low enough to be able to package it and ship out for consumers. So how does white tea get its name? Well, if you look at this example that I have of one of the white teas, you can actually see that there's a white hint to the tea. And that's because in the plucking stage, they are made by plucking the new bud, which still has some white feathery down, almost like hairs. And I have an example here that's a single bud, and it did have a leaf attached. So you can see how you see the white feathery hairs of that bud, which gives it that white appearance. And because it is such a new, fresh bud, it makes white tea have a very delicate flavor. There are 3 main white teas that originate from China. Those are the silver needle, which is the most prized tea. Now, that is going to be one that if it is a true high-quality silver needle, is going to be very expensive. So I do not have one on hand at the moment because I don't invest in it too often, but it is a very wonderful tea. It has a sweet, delicate flavor, a nice fresh aroma, and all of the parts that are plucked are just the unopened buds. So it's strictly fresh, new buds in the spring that have no leaves. This tea is the 2nd grade of tea that is a white peony. This is one bud with the white hairs, and then 1 to 2 leaves. So again, you can see on this one that I picked up that there is a bud, and then you can see where there was a leaf, but of course it's broken off in the packing process and the shipping. But you can see here that there's a mixture of the white buds and then the leaves that are there and a little bit of stems, because literally it's plucked and then withered and then dried and then packaged. So very little processing. The third grade of tea primarily produced in China is Kumaon tea. And that is also sometimes referred to as a peasant tea. It's the lowest quality. It has a few more leaves picked, and it may be picked later in the season. So it doesn't have that fresh, floral, right away flavor. These teas, once you get into the white peony and then even more so in the Kumaon, it moves away from that delicate fruity flavor to more of a nutty flavor, but it's still delicious. So today, we're going to do a taste test of this white tea, which is a white peony, about that middle grade. And we're going to do a test of another white tea from India. And again, white tea wasn't well known outside of China until recently, but other countries have started producing it. So let me introduce you to the next tea. This is a white tea from India. It's from the Kumaon area, which is near the Himalayan mountains. And you'll notice that you really don't see a lot of white downy as you do in the white peony tea. It looks more leaves, but it does say that it is picked in the spring right after winter, and it is the buds that are picked. When you look at the teas side by side, as I have a little more easily on this plate, you'll also notice the size difference. And this is attributed to, most likely, if you remember, the majority of Chinese teas come from the Camellia sinensis variety sinensis plant, which has smaller leaves. And most of the teas that are produced in India come from the Camellia sinensis variety Assamica plant, which have larger leaves. So you can see very clearly here how large that leaf is compared to one of these leaves. So I'm really curious to try these two teas. I will be honest with you, I have not taste tested the Kumaon white tea yet. So this is a real treat for me, as I've only had Silver Needle and the white peony and the Kumaon, which are all the Chinese teas. So this will be exciting to taste test these and see what the differences are and what the flavors are like. So I'm glad that you're here to join me on this little experiment. I heated the water and poured it into our tasting cups, so our teas are currently now steeping. If you remember from one of our original episodes, that white tea is brewed at a lower temperature than the boiling point like black teas. Now, white teas are sometimes said to steep at around the same temperatures as green teas, which would be approximately 165 to 185 degrees Fahrenheit. But in the case of these white teas, these are actually steeped at a little higher temperature recommendation. And part of that is because they're not just that delicate bud like the Silver Needle, but they also have some leaves in with them. So this tea was actually recommended from the manufacturer to use boiling water. And this tea was recommended at 190 degrees Fahrenheit. So I am leaving these both at about 190 degrees Fahrenheit, was the water temperature that I used. And we steeped them for about 3 minutes. So I'm going to pour them in and we'll start on our taste test. Well, I'm excited to try these. Now, before we actually begin tasting, let's talk a little bit about the leaves and the aroma. So if you notice the wet leaves, again, these are much larger compared to these, and they're a little darker in color. And I was curious how the color of the tea would turn out. And you can see that just very slight hints. So you might not even be able to pick it up on camera, but this tea has a little bit darker yellow hue to it than the white peony does. And I was expecting that because of the darker leaf and less delicate buds. So, looking at the aroma of the white peony, it has a nice, sweet, fresh smell to the leaves. Really enjoyable. And let's try the Kumaon white tea. This one has a little bit more of a fresh vegetal smell. And the container says that it's going to taste more like a honeydew melon. So if I think about the rind on that honeydew, there's a nice, fresh summer smell to that. As I smell a little more deeply, I am picking up that sweetness of like the melon would remind me of. All right, time to taste. So this is the white peony from the Fujian province of China. It has a nice, delicate, mild flavor to it. There is definitely a fruitiness in this tea. Not like the shumei. When I drink the shumei, it has a little bit more of a nutty note. And I enjoy drinking that one in the winter when you have that nutty taste and then I add cinnamon to it. It's really good. This one's a little lighter, milder, with more of a fruity, sweet flavor. There's also no astringency, no bitterness to this tea at all. Let's try the Kumaon tea and see what that one tastes like. And again, I'm excited because this is the first time that I am tasting this is with you. This has a nice sweet flavor to it, but it's definitely stronger than the white peony tea. And again, I would kind of expect that even from my experience with drinking, let's say, Chinese black teas to Indian black teas. They do have a stronger, more intense flavor to them. And there's a little bit of a bitterness that's come out. So if I were to re-steep this tea, I would either use a little bit lower temperature of water or I would steep it for just a little less time. But it still has a nice flavor. It's bright. It does have that fruity flavor to it. And both of them would be enjoyable either on a spring morning, a summer day, hot or cold, or again in winter with maybe some cinnamon or vanilla added to it. Definitely a treat. The other interesting thing about this one, I can't help but tell just a little bit of history, which I found really interesting, is the British had brought the tea to India and planted some seeds up in this area where this tea was harvested. And when they were harvesting the tea, they realized that it wasn't working too well because of how far they were from the port, that it just wasn't practical to carry the tea and transport it all the way from where it was being grown in the Himalayan mountains all the way to the port. So they basically abandoned the practice, and then this area remained dormant for a while. Some families moved in and decided to begin producing tea. And it was about the 1990s, which is very recent, when the government stepped in to help some of the tea farmers begin to produce tea in this part of the area again and be able to make it for larger consumption of the population. So it's really an interesting tale of tea and um, how the teas are grown and how they got where they are today, and how different countries have taken on different types of tea to explore the wonderful world of tea drinking. There's one additional point that I want to make clear is we talked last week about green tea and how it is the least oxidized tea. Well, then we talked about white tea just now and saying that it's the least processed. There isn't a lot of oxidation that occurs in white tea, but because it's not heated right away to stop that enzymatic process, as it's laying out withering or drying, if the leaves happen to get bruised or, as they're stacked on top of each other and laying there might be a small level of oxidation that is occurring. But again, it is very minimal. When we talk about the health benefits of white tea, there are a lot of similarities from white tea to green tea, and some people really like the fact that it's the least processed. Now, there are a lot of controversies out there as to whether white tea truly contains less caffeine than green tea, which is typically what you'll hear, as well as the fact that because it hasn't gone through any heating process, that it has greater nutrients and antioxidants in it than the other teas, including green tea. Again, there's a lot of controversy around those studies. And as we've talked before, tea is such a complex industry because it really depends on the type of plant, the variety, where it's grown, when it's picked, how it's processed, that it really is difficult to narrow down and say white tea as a whole has less caffeine than green tea as a whole, which has less caffeine than black tea as a whole. Generally, that's somewhat understood. But when we look at white tea, several of the articles that I was reading was actually saying that some white teas might have a higher content than even some black teas because the premise is that the new leaves, when they're plucked, have higher caffeine levels because that's one of the compounds that is part of the natural plant defense, which keeps away insects. And when do plants need the biggest defense? It's when they're growing their leaves and they're very young and tender and susceptible. Whereas the older, more mature leaves that insects might not be as interested in, they don't need to produce as much caffeine, basically, because the plant is a little more established or those leaves are a little more established. So I'm not going to say for sure that white tea is a great caffeine-free, low caffeine alternative. However, there's enough research out there that does state that it may be more likely. And most likely, your silver needle, because it is those beginning new fresh buds, are going to be higher in caffeine as a white tea than, let's say, the Shumei, which is picked later in the season and is older, more mature leaves. So that might be something you want to consider if your body is sensitive to caffeine or if you're drinking a tea at night and don't want it to stimulate and keep you up. Well, I've really enjoyed this time with you, and especially because I got to taste one of the new teas that I've never tried before. I'm glad you could join me for that little adventure. And I hope that if you never have explored the world of white tea, you've been primarily in black and green, that you're now a little bit piqued in your curiosity to go try a white tea. Yes, there are tea bags that are white tea, but again, I always encourage to try the loose leaf varieties because they just offer so much more quality, and that means much higher levels of flavor and a much better experience. So I look forward to seeing you next week right here at Rebecca's Tea Cozy for our next episode of Let's Talk Tea, where we'll be checking out yellow tea. Now, this is the rarest tea of all, so I hope that you can join me and learn a little bit more about another new tea. Until then, be blessed with a cup of tea.